What's up, everybody, and welcome to the Insurrection Inc. podcast. We want to thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Hey guys, it's me, Jay, the editor, and I just want to say that before we get on to the interview with Per, there were a few audio issues along the way because of Zoom, so please just bear with us and enjoy the show.
We're live.
Welcome back to the Insurrection Inc. podcast. Today we've got me, Porter, along with Stratty, Jay, and Peter, and our special guest today is Dr. Per Bylund of Oklahoma State University. He's a fellow at the Mises Institute and specializes in studying entrepreneurship and value creation in the economy, and is also a very prominent libertarian, active on Twitter, active at the Mises Institute, as I said. We're very happy to have him on today. Hi, Per.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, Stratty, I think you wanted to start off with the first question.
So I wanted to ask, because this is something I'm very curious about whenever we learn about or meet people that are libertarians but aren't American. So I wanted to ask, how did you fall into the libertarian line of thinking growing up in Sweden?
Oh, good question. Let's see here. I actually started out in politics. And then the obvious question is, oh, really, why? And that question I have no answer to at all. I really have no clue. So I got involved in politics because I was not a social democrat. And the social democrats have ruled Sweden for, well, since the 20s or so. The previous 20s, and the 1900s, right? It was just basically taking a stand against the establishment. And then I started in, I guess they're like these Swedish Republicans or something like that. I started going to their courses, learning about ideology, learning about politics, learning about values and things like that. And I was exposed to these classical liberals, sort of night watchman state people. And I thought they were completely nuts. Because their arguments, they were just so radical and so weird. But I was kind of a free market guy. But what they were saying, like drugs, oh my goodness, they must hate people and they're so obnoxious. But then, of course, being a logical person, after a while, you start to realize that what they're saying actually makes a whole lot more sense than all these arbitrary opinions that everybody else has. So you start adopting their views, and then when you start adopting it, it goes pretty fast downhill, because then you start thinking yourself too, okay, but this view that I have is logical and it fits. But this other view that I have doesn't really have a foundation. It doesn't really fit with my other views either. So why don't I get a severe headache from having my views? Then you start thinking about this stuff, right? And then I was fortunate enough to do a year abroad in college. Being a serious student with the Swedish government paying for my tuition abroad, I applied to go to universities in California, Australia, and Hawaii. And a university in Honolulu responded right away saying, hey, we'd love to have you. And I was like, yay, the Swedish government would love to pay for me to go to Honolulu. So I was there for a year. And I happened to sign up to a course two courses the first semester in economics that were taught by Ken Schooland. And he's been in the libertarian movement for, I was going to say a century, but that's probably not true. But for a very long time. And he sort of gave me the ammunition and pushed me over the edge. So after taking his course back in '96, this was, I was definitely a libertarian. I stopped even pretending I was anything else. And after that, I mean, still a what I call a statist with a fetish for small. So a libertarian who wants a state. An anarchist in the fall of '98, and then of course your obvious question here is, how the heck do you know it was the fall of '98? Well, that was the year that I got elected for office. So it's very easy to remember when you're elected for office and become an anarchist at the very same time. right? So I was debating with a friend of mine, and we both became anarchists. We tried to solve the problem of courts and laws on the market, right? And we were using the election campaign, working all day for the party, sitting for hours every day debating how could you possibly solve this problem, because logically we need to get rid of the monstrosity, but practically how would that happen? How would that work? So we had all these ideas with like drafting an architecture for courts in different levels and all this stuff. And then for some reason I was directed to read David Friedman's Machinery of Freedom. And I read it, and then I hated myself for a little bit because it was so easy. I mean, reading it, it's like, why didn't I see this? Obviously brainwashing, right? And after that, I mean, there's no going back. I mean, you know what they say, that libertarians, there are no libertarians in a pandemic, or if there's a big crisis or anything like that, which of course is pure bullshit.
Yeah.
But I think if you are a libertarian and you're still holding on to the state in some fashion, going back is not that hard, right? Because you haven't actually taken the step. So you are a statist with a fetish for small. So why wouldn't you just then say, a little bigger, maybe even a little bigger? It's no big deal, right? But if you have actually abolished it, then taking it back, saying, maybe we should have people with guns just coercing everybody. That would be a solution to a problem. Well, if that is the step you have to take, then that's a huge step. I mean, it's not just maybe we should just give them a little more power than they already have, because I mean that's incrementalism, right? Whereas introducing a state or abolishing it too is a huge leap, right? So very long answer to your very short question.
I love that. No worries at all. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you brought up David Friedman's Machinery of Freedom, since we interviewed him just 2 weeks ago. And we'll get back to some questions about what he said later towards the end of the interview. But next, we wanted to move into some economics questions. You are an economist after all, so we thought that'd be good. Your probably most groundbreaking work, at least in my opinion, is your theory of the firm. So I wanted to ask you to give basically a quick overview of that. What's wrong with the typical like Ronald Coase transaction cost analysis, and where do you differ from that? Why do you think your explanation is better?
Okay, so that question, you're basically begging for an answer that's even longer than the previous one. But to keep it
I understand that's hard to condense.
Yeah, and I mean, you're asking an academic to please tell me about your research. I mean, that's the that's
you also
a big
wrote
no.
a whole book on it. So.
Yeah, exactly, and then that was a brief summary, the book. So no, there's something wrong with the theories of the firm, because economically speaking, we really have no clue what a firm is. So for most of us not thinking about as theorists, instead just looking at what is going on in the world as a normal human being, I was going to say, then a firm is no big deal. But then if you look at the economic function, what does it actually do that is not just based off of legal requirements or limited liability laws and things like that, but economically, what is it? And there are no big answers. So Coase thought that the answer was, since you mentioned him, and he's sort of the authority in this area, he thought the answer was that, well, the price mechanism is efficient in allocating resources, but it's costly. And having instead basically a manager or an authority taking the price mechanism's place could save on that cost and instead direct resources. So basically, it's an argument for planning. It's an argument for sort of economic authoritarianism, right? So there's a lot of bidding, a lot of trying to discover and figure out information if you use the price mechanism. And all of that can be avoided if you just have one guy, preferably, I suppose, with a mustache, directing resources instead. So that's his whole theory. The problem of course, is that he's saying that, well, this direction happens within the firm. Okay, but you're sort of assuming what a firm is before you try to explain what the firm is. And that's not good theory, right? And why does he say that it's authority within the firm and not say you have a long-term contract with a supplier? Well, it's because of the employment contract is different than a market contract. Well, that's a legal explanation, right? The employment contract is different legally speaking than a market contract. That's not an economic definition either. So I had a problem with this when I was introduced to it in grad school already. This didn't make much sense in my mind. There has to be something else because the firm seems so different. So I started drafting, and my dissertation is on sort of critiquing the theories out there, especially the transaction cost theory of Coase and Williams and others, and drafting a view of the firm that is sort of based off of Mises instead. So Mises has this there's a part in Human Action when he talks about the division of labor being this fantastic invention, or maybe discovery is better, where we can improve productivity like crazy. I mean, Adam Smith realized this, and all economists, well, up until Keynes anyway, realized this, and Austrians realize this now too. The specialization under the division of labor, that's how we organize production, that's how we increase output, that's where economic growth comes from, this everything basically. Right, so I figured that should play a role in the firm, right? The firm might have something to do with that. So what I did was simply said, okay, so let's assume there are no organizations. There's just an economic model with decentralized economic actors. So people are producing, they're trading, whatever, they're contracting, but there's no authority or anything like that. So it's a very decentralized free market system, like any model where Mises would start, right? Okay, so looking at specialization, what happens in this economy? Well, they would specialize more and more and become more productive, so more output. They would make more money. They would become the whole society, this whole economy would get richer and more prosperous. But how far would they go? Well, Adam Smith talks about how it's basically a function of population. So basically, the more reproductive you are, the more productive you get, right, as society. And he says there's a little bit of innovation too, but it's not a whole lot. His example is a boy in a factory running up the stairs to open a vent when the furnace overheats, and then running up again to close it when the furnace gets too cold. And his innovation is to tie a string to the vent, so he can, instead of running the stairs, he can just stand beneath it and pull the string. Right? It's not a very advanced innovation. So what would happen in this economic model is that, well, all of this would apply, right? If more people enter, you would have a little more specialization. People would learn over time, but it would incrementally become more productive. It wouldn't take any leaps forward. Okay, so why is that? Well, because implementing a new innovation that is a completely new way of seeing things, a new process of production or something like that, it's a leap forward. That new process has to be completed. It has to have people doing all the parts from scratch and until a consumer product, or it fails. And you can't implement that yourself. And you can't write market contracts for these services because you just invented the process. So you will have to take responsibility for it and attract people and probably pay them to educate them for how to carry out these tasks and coordinate all this production, and then see, oh, is there market demand or not? And did this actually work out, right? Well, this type of coordination is not really possible within the market using market means. It's not something that happens within the price mechanism, right? Because there are no market wages for these new occupations that you just made up. And there are probably tools you have to produce in order to support this new process that you imagined and all these things. So since this whole project then is outside the reach of the price mechanism, it is sort of on its own by definition, right? So this must happen outside of the extent of the market. This is the famous term from Adam Smith, right? So it's the market is limited by the extent of the market, or the specialization is. Well, obviously, if you implement this innovation and you make loads of money off of it, others will imitate what you're doing. And the more people imitate and try to copy your process, the more they will bid for your employees that you already trained, and the more market prices will emerge for those resources that were in your process, which basically means that this process gets incorporated in the market, because suddenly there is a market for for all these resources that had no market before. So through the firm, then defined as simply an innovation implemented outside the extent of the market can take a leap forward instead of being limited by this incremental increases in specialization. So that's a very brief way of explaining what my theory of the firm is. It has an economic function, and it's helping the market take leaps forward in terms of specialization and productivity.
And I think that's something that not a whole lot of people have ever thought about. Synthesizing Adam Smith and Mises and all that work, it's almost surprised that no one's thought of it before, but I think it's really groundbreaking. So I'm impressed at how much you were able to give a concise answer, because that's basically the entire focus of your research. I've got a question next.
Yeah, who's got the next question?
Peter, I think you wanted to ask about the lockdown, right?
So Sweden has taken a very interesting approach to lockdown. It hasn't really done a lockdown like many other countries, so it's not really a heavy-handed lockdown. And would this be a better approach? And where do people go wrong when they insist that a government lockdown is necessary to protect us during pandemics, like a full-on stay in your home, you can't leave lockdown?
Well, where do they go wrong? I mean, where they go wrong is simply thinking that the government is a solution. Right, that's the short answer. As for Sweden, it is kind of ironic that Sweden turns out to be sort of libertarian when I leave Sweden, but it's not quite as libertarian or open as it might seem from the outside, because people are using that as a critique of what we might refer to as the Sweden model or something. What they are doing, though, is they're not taking political control over the economy, saying that, oh, these businesses are not essential, so you can't do business. And these businesses are essential, so you must do business, as it is here, right? So instead, what they've done is focus on recommendations, and they focused on protecting risk groups, so old and frail people. They are recommended to, well, basically engage in social distancing and not hang out with other people, whereas all the other people they're recommended to not be too close to each other, so as to just slow down the spread. But other than that, there are no closures. And I mean, listening to the Swedish authorities, there are sound reasons for this, simply because this is a new virus. We knew little about it. We know about that type of virus, but since there is no treatment and there's no cure and there's no vaccine, and those people experienced in epidemiology and things like that, they know that, well, we can't really expect anything for a year or two. Then the conclusion must be that this virus will go through the population, and the population might get immune from it. But the main point is that most people will not get harmed from it, right? So most people seem to be asymptomatic, so they don't even notice it. And on those assumptions, the Swedish government and the Swedish authority, I mean, there's a government agency who makes these recommendations. They simply draw the conclusion saying that, well, okay, so we can't stop it. Some people will die no matter what we do. They will die either soon or not quite as soon, but we can't really do much about it. What we can do is make sure that they get the care that we can give. by basically flattening the curve as everybody's talking about, right? So that's what they did in Sweden. What they said was simply, okay, so let's have no visitors to nursery homes. Let's tell everybody who is old or who is frail to stay at home and just protect themselves, and then let the rest of the population just go about their day as semi-normal, and then this will pass, right? So maybe there will be some herd immunity at some point, but that's not really the strategy. The strategy is to just let the virus run its course and make sure to not overwhelm healthcare. So the little bit social distancing recommendations in order to slow the spread so that ICUs are not overwhelmed. And at the same time, they built more ICU capacity. So I think they tripled the capacity in a few weeks or something like that. And it's even bigger now. I mean, why? Well, Sweden's authorities, the agency and the government, they concluded right away that there's no freaking thing we can do. So either we try to just slow it down a little bit at minimal cost, or we shut everything down at enormous cost, and the outcome will be practically the same. And I mean, if you have those two options, if you have any reasonable thought in your mind, if you are at all rational, you would of course pick the lower cost, right? Most other countries seem to have panicked completely. So that's it. I'm pretty sure that Swedish politicians, like most other politicians, they also panicked and wanted to do a lot. And as long as you do something, you're a winner in politics, right? And what I've heard is that they couldn't find legal support to shut down private businesses. So they couldn't do it. There's also a weird political situation right now in Sweden with any constellation of parties in government would necessarily be a minority. So nobody really dares to do something radical because they would immediately get shut down by everybody else. And at the same time, Sweden is a high trust society. So if the agency who has basically all the experts in this area, if they say that this is the plan and this is the reason for the plan, please do this, then most people will do that, right? So people trust the agency, and the agency trusts that people will do what is the better thing to do, basically, right? So there's no need for force, which is a cultural thing, I guess, to some extent. It's also a historic experience, I suppose, that since the agencies do not usually crack down on people or go beyond what they're supposed to do, then people trust that they will not, and therefore they will listen more, maybe. But I mean, there are many things that sort of play together in the Sweden example in this pandemic. What is most surprising, I suppose, is that Sweden is continuing on this path, even though they are under immense pressure from all the other governments in the world to crank down. Because of course, all the other governments, they don't want an example of another strategy with less emergency powers that actually worked, right? Because that's going to make them look really bad. So it's better to have just one method all across the board so that everybody's as bad. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
oh no, it's a really good answer. I wasn't expecting something this in depth. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I've followed it a little bit since, obviously, I lived my first 3 decades plus in Sweden, and my family's there and everything like that. And I realized that, well, people are going to ask about this, right? And I read the Swedish news, so I follow along. And I mean, this is an opportunity for me to I don't know, write op-eds or what columns or whatever else, and informing on what is actually going on, because there's a lot of BS. I have on Twitter, I've pointed out 2 articles of the 2 I've seen from CNN where they write about Sweden and the pandemic, and both have been outright lies. So I mean, people who watch the news, I can see how they're terrified or how they have these weird ideas about things. But this, I don't know what the media are doing, but it seems like a campaign more than anything else. And then I can use what I have and what I know to at least spread a little bit of actual information.
All right. So apparently Porter's a very bad central planner, so you're gonna have to bear with me for a few questions. But for our listeners, it would be accurate to call you an agorist, right?
Yes.
All right. So I have a few questions about agorism. One of the first ones, I'm taking this one from another friend who couldn't be here today. Obviously, with agorists, there's a very strong opposition to any form of the political process, even something that would be considered by others to be like defensive voting. So could you just explain for us real quick why agorists reject the political process entirely?
Sure. I mean, the simple answer is that it's not moral. I mean, it's a system based on coercion and force. So if you are against coercion and force, I should say, then it's your duty to do as little as possible to support that system. I mean, to be against is one thing. It doesn't mean that you can necessarily escape it, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm working for a state university, so that's an agorist fail right there. But at the same time, I mean, there's crowding out by the government. I mean, there are no private roads that I can choose to drive on and things like that. So some of these things you just, and you have financed yourself too through taxes. Mm-hmm. So why not use them? But I mean, it's simply the moral aspect of it. Since as an agorist or as a libertarian, you are against the use of force and aggression on anybody else. You can't be in favor of a system that is based on aggression. So I think it's Konkin who said that you have a moral duty, not an actual duty, but a moral duty to withdraw as much as possible of your own life from the sphere of the state. Right? And some people can do that a lot. Some people can't do that as much, but you should, morally speaking, do as much as possible, and you should do more and more. I think his example would be like utilize the black market and whatnot else if you can, right?
Mm-hmm. And since you brought up Compton, I've got another question about agorism, where the general consensus is that it's a form of left-wing anarchism, mostly because of Konkin's views. And what's your take on it being considered left-wing? Is it accurate? And where do you think Konkin went wrong with his economics?
Wow. Well, is it left-wing? That depends on the definition, right? Mm-hmm. So is it left-wing in the world of the state, in the politics within a state? Left-wing means pretty much it's better to have politicians plan everybody's economies than have people trade themselves. In that sense, agorism, of course, is not leftist in any sense, right? But on the other hand, on the right, you have all this other weird stuff going on. But if you go back historically, and I think that's more appropriate, then you had the radical powers and the radical, well, they were parliamentarians, right? But in the French Parliament, those who didn't want to just preserve what was and go back to the king and nobility and things like that, those who wanted radical change, they were sitting on the left side of the aisle. And those who wanted to preserve everything, the conservatives, were on the right side. So you had socialists and classical liberals sitting together because they wanted to change a lot. And I mean, the old sort of classical alliance is between socialists and liberals, classical liberals. And socialists are, in a sense, took over after the classical liberals because they were not in agreement with the method. Because classical liberals would be more let go, right? Whereas the socialists wanted to force the change. So it was sort of born out of the classical liberal movement, you can say, or that type of ideal. But it's sort of funny to have Frédéric Bastiat and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon sitting side by side and going, yeah, screw the conservatives. I don't think they would agree with a whole lot of other things. But I mean, then again, reading Proudhon, he was definitely a free market guy, right? So they're the so-called left anarchists have misunderstood him completely because they are against money and markets and all this other stuff, whereas Proudhon was definitely for those things, right? So I would say Agorists are left libertarians in the sense that they're more radical, but they're also left in the sense that they recognize the privileges that corporations have, for instance, that big capital has in under state capitalism or cronyism. They have a lot more influence than regular folks, basically, right? And it's not only buying politicians, or as we call it in this country, campaign donations, right? But it's all this other influence that they have. I mean, if you're a large corporation, you have probably benefited from a lot of restrictions on competition and restrictions on the market already. And if you are, say, Microsoft or Amazon or General Electric, and you have tens of thousands of people in your employment, of course you can use that as to get influence as well. So if there is a new law that they're discussing in Congress that you don't like, then you can say, well, maybe we'll just take our business and go somewhere else. That will leave you with another 100,000 people unemployed. Well, that's a whole lot more than if I say, well, I'm going to take my consulting business somewhere else, which means I will sell my house, and that's basically it, right?
Yeah.
Of course, that's no influence whatsoever, right? And that means that they probably have had quite a few laws and things like that formulated in their favor. I mean, there's plenty of corporate welfare in this country and all over the world. And very often, I mean, looking at it from a very strictly free market point of view, in that situation, you would not have people employed by companies to the same extent at all, because you would have plenty of other opportunities to either turn your back on society if you would like, or do like sustenance farming, or just do it yourself with your family or whatever. But there are plenty of other opportunities, so you don't have to accept long-term employment with anyone. So it would be employers looking for workers rather than workers looking for employment the way it is today, which means people's salaries would be, relatively speaking, much higher, because you would have to pay people to basically give up that freedom, give up that optionality that they have for a long-term contract. Which means that whether or not individual businesses or business overall have gotten privileges, they are benefiting from that privilege simply because people need to get work, which means the wages are lower than they probably otherwise would be. So I know this sounds sort of like Karl Marx's The Iron Law of Wages or something like that oh, no one will pay more than barely will keep people alive because they will just push wages down. I mean, that's not what it is, and that law has been debunked a number of times already. But there is pressure on wages down from the free market level, right? So in that sense, workers are definitely more oppressed than corporations. So taking that, and basically just recognizing that fact, separates agorists from what Kevin Carson would call vulgar libertarians, right? Who would probably are libertarians because they started out reading Ayn Rand, and then they read Rothbard, and they were like, oh, so Ayn Rand without the state. Well, then you have a focus on corporations and businessmen first, and you sort of forget the other side. So of course everybody's suppressed by the government. That's what governments do. That's the whole definition of it. But it's not necessarily the case that it is exactly what we think it is like, right? So, I mean, I wrote a book on what I call the unrealized, what things would be like if it was a free market, and basically what we're missing out on. See, Porter's got it right there. And I think what we're definitely missing out on is wages for workers, much more than profits for corporations, since they benefit too from all these restrictions on the market and thus on competition. So that's a long-winded answer to the question, and I'm not sure I touched very much on the answer, but.
No, I think you did. And it's very interesting that you do bring up like the sort of Ayn Rand to Rothbard pipeline, because that would be a very big misreading of Rothbard, in my opinion, if you were to approach it like that, because he was never averse to critiquing companies for abusing their privileges with the state and asserting their power through that way. So I think that's very interesting. But again, one more question for me.
I'm not sure the ideas are necessarily compatible. I mean, to some extent, of course they are. Mm-hmm. But I think that is a very common path that people take, that they read. I mean, it usually begins with Ayn Rand, right? And then you're exposed to other things, and then you're exposed to Rothbard's libertarianism, and then maybe you abolish government in your mind in a way. I mean, so you get rid of that virus, but you sort of keep the protect business type of a knee-jerk reaction. So. Mm-hmm. You see immediately on the news when there is, say, an antitrust case, you immediately take the corporation side, which is not necessarily a bad thing in that case. But I mean, if in a totally free market, you probably would not have that huge corporation. And most of them are built off of intellectual property privileges and things like that too. So there's a lot wrong with being a radical libertarian and taking a corporation's point of view, not taking the anti-government point of view, right? Because that's obvious, but the corporation might not be beyond blame. That's the issue.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot lately with a lot of the like tech companies and all that. So that is very true. One more, and then I'll let someone else take it from here. But speaking of Rothbard, so he was a very vocal critic of agorism, and we've all heard like his case against like, oh, the average wage earner, they can't blah, blah, blah. But that's not really the part that interests me about his argument. One that I still can't quite wrap my head around is his view that dealing in the black and gray markets might actually prolong the life of the government you're trying to fight. Then he gives the example of the USSR. And I can't quite understand that one. So maybe if you could enlighten us on that.
I don't know if I can enlighten you, but I can give you my best guess on what he meant by that. I mean, in a sense, I teach very briefly in my college course on Austrian economics. I teach a little bit on the Soviet Union example. And I mean, Soviet Union imploded after just a few years. And that's why they had a new economic policy, which opened up consumer markets a little bit, and small farmers could actually save some of what they produced themselves and stuff like that, right? So everything was not publicly owned. And that, in a sense, kept the Soviet Union alive for another 70 years. Mm-hmm. Well, so from that point of view, yeah, if the only way of getting rid of government is through the crash, then anything you do to push back on government and restoring a little bit of liberty, a little bit of market, and thus engaging in free market exchange, that is the black market, that means that you're basically you're supporting the system in that sense, right? Because you're say you and a few neighbors start exchanging, you start growing, I don't know, carrots in your backyard or something, and the other neighbor has tomatoes, and you start exchanging those, and maybe you start to have your own money or whatever, and you use Bitcoin or whatever you feel like, right? But you don't pay taxes, and there's no regulation involved and stuff like that. Well, I mean, those things can grow, and that means you are not, for those things, dependent on the state, which means the state does not have to support you, right? So there's less pressure on the state, so the state can I mean, even though it is sort of a cancer tumor on the society's body, what you're doing is keeping a little bit of the body healthy, meaning the tumor can survive sooner. But that is also assuming that the only way of getting rid of the tumor is letting it grow and eat the whole body, right? And then it will go away, which might be true. I don't know. I mean, libertarians have always discussed, do we need a huge crash to just get rid of the monster, or can we push it back step by step, right? I mean, and Rothbard's button, if you push the button, the government goes away. Well, I mean, it's the button or the crash. If that is what you're sort of looking for, then anything you do that is sort of supportive of keeping government alive would be a bad thing, because it would keep it alive for a little longer, right? Mm-hmm. I think that is what he means. But Konkin has exactly the opposite argument, right, through counter economics, saying that no, you should withdraw your actions from the realm of the state and instead engage in black market trade and so forth, because then you're building institutions outside of the state, which means when the state finally crumbles, or if people just turn their backs on it because it's not necessary, why would we listen to all these damn bureaucrats and politicians when we're already taking care of ourselves, right? So those are two very different strategies, I would think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say I'm a quite big Rothbardian, but I feel like that might have been one of his inconsistencies, because he was the guy who said take liberty where you can, and then he sort of, this is trying to take liberty in your own personal life where you can. So I think that was a pretty good answer for what his view might have been, because it's still a little bit of a weird view in my opinion, but it makes sense.
It comes down to what strategy you have, right?
Yeah. Porter, what's up?
Yeah, lastly, we wanted to move into some general libertarian philosophy questions, kind of some miscellaneous questions.
All right.
One time on Pete Quinones' show, you said something about the Constitution. I don't remember your exact words, but you were talking about, it was the history of anarchism episodes. You were talking about kind of how it moved to America. And you mentioned that a lot of libertarians in America now kind of uphold the Constitution as this document of freedom. And you mentioned that you disagreed with that. And I agree with your view on that, but a lot of people are still kind of hesitant to reject the Constitution like that. So could you explain your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on the Constitution? Sure. I mean, my thoughts on the Constitution are basically Lysander Spooner's. I mean, it's either, looking at what we have, either the Constitution has not been able to stop it, or the Constitution was supportive of it. Right? So if you as a libertarian think that the Constitution is the way to go, then it has already failed. So that seems to be a very strange method to use, because we already tried it. Right? And unless you are a libertarian, you think that what we have today is your ideal society. But I don't think that is actually what you believe, right? Or you're basically saying that, well, the Constitution, the way it should be interpreted, that's what society should be like. Well, that's just placing yourself above everybody else, right? And you have a large number of people having been involved for a couple of hundred years in interpreting and enforcing and implementing the Constitution. And this is where we turned out. I think any such rule, you will always, especially with time, find ways around those rules. That's why the market works so well, because the market sort of creates its own rules. I mean, all those prices and standards and everything, and they are changing. All the institutions on the market are changing so that they reflect what people believe and how people behave and what people think is right. So pretty much what the common law system is like, at least in theory, where the judges are making rulings in conflicts based off of their best understanding of what other rulings there have been previously and what people would have in general believed about that agreement they had before, or who is in the wrong, right? And that will change over time. Why? Because people change over time, because behaviors change over time, because values change over time. Writing something down, I mean, even words change their meaning. And in my own field of study, that's pretty obvious, because reading Adam Smith, for instance, he talks about the undertaker. Now, whoever today would say that, oh, we need the driving force of the economy, Mises says, is the undertaker. Well, that would be pretty strange, because today the undertaker is not really the entrepreneur anymore, right? So that word has changed its meaning. And I mean, Cantillon changed the meaning of the word entrepreneur too, as Mark Thornton has discovered in his research, right? So before Cantillon, the entrepreneur was basically a government contractor. So it was whoever signed a contract for building a cathedral or a castle or whatever with the government. So pretty much someone who had stable revenue, but could manipulate the cost, right? That was an entrepreneur. And Cantillon took that and he just flipped it upside down. And he said, you know what, I'm going to treat entrepreneur as exactly the reverse. Someone who knows what the costs are when you start production, but doesn't really know the price of things or whether you can actually sell it at all of your output, right? So that's entrepreneurship. That's the uncertainty bearing of it. Well, that's exactly the opposite. And that's more like we see it today. So writing something down in a rule and then letting it be sort of the number one guiding force in society for hundreds and hundreds of years, that is problematic, because all those words and what they were intended to mean will change over time. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, that if you at the same time have a structure in place where people can gain power over other people and thereby possibly become rich and famous without actually going through the hassle of serving others, as you would have to in the market, then people will probably fall for that, and the wrong people will fall for that, right? Because they're trying to avoid work, and they don't really like people, so how could they serve them in the market? And they will find ways around the document. So step by step, they will find, well, wait a minute, maybe this is a way of doing this that is not necessarily covered by the Constitution, so it's not really prohibited, right? So, and we see this with all laws. I mean, the Uber is a good example that I use in class, where had they started a taxi business, they would be regulated like crazy and they would never have been able to do anything at all. So had they said, we're a taxi company, but we're going to use an app, no Uber. So what they did was basically say, we're going to run everything like a taxi service pretty much through the app, but we're going to pitch this as and position this as something completely different, which means all those rules and regulations for taxi businesses do not apply, right? And that has been sort of the fight in the courts since then, because taxi companies are pissed off because they are, well, the only reason they stay alive as companies is because they have the privilege of being basically monopolists in the taxi business. And then you have this other business and they don't consider themselves a taxi company and they do things a little differently, so they don't fit that classification. So they are not regulated the same way. And then the politicians freak out too, because they don't have regulations for that specific type of business. So they have to quickly figure out how to regulate it. That's the political solution to stuff, right? So, and that undermines the whole taxi business thing. So now taxi companies are adopting different ways of doing business. So in 10 years, no one is going to recognize a taxi company anymore because no one is doing business that way anymore, right? So that's another example of how everything seems to change a little bit over time, and they should change. And I don't think any libertarian is actually arguing against change and progress. Rather the opposite, that they want more market, more progress. Well, that means changing people's minds. That means changing behaviors. And you can't capture that in one document for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's just impossible. So there's so many things wrong with thinking that that document, it doesn't matter who wrote it, well, unless maybe a god or something, but even very wise men writing a document and keeping it in very general terms, it will still have, I mean, the terms will change meaning, the interpretation will change meaning, society will change, And then you have also the people within the system do what they can to avoid being regulated by that document. I mean, basically every incentive is wrong for the Constitution.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's pretty much my views on it too. All right, Jay, did you want to ask your question next?
Yeah, sure. Can't get enough questions. So this was something that recently sprung to my mind, where it's the idea of these companies like Enron, which, like you just brought up, they abuse the sort of regulations that are there and they lie their way into it. And then there's others like Bain Capital or this gun company called Freedom Group, which their business model is buy up a company and they're like their investment firm and then run it into the ground. Is there any way in a free society to avoid these sort of companies that engage in what I think could be, easily considered fraud, or is this something that should be dealt with after the fact?
Could you say that last part again? Because
yeah, sorry, I don't know what's going on with my mic. But basically, like, is there a way in a free society to avoid these sort of companies that would be, predatory and what I think could be considered fraud? I'm not sure if they are, except for Enron, which obviously was fraudulent. Or is it something that just has to be punished after the fact for their doings?
Well, I mean, if you have a perfectly free market, then the incentives would be better aligned, and the incentives would always be for, in a sense, protecting yourself first. So I've written about the pandemic and things like that, for instance. I mean, as a business owner, you can't know who has the virus, right? Well, no, you cannot. But if you say that, oh, there's a pandemic going on, everybody's welcome into my store. Well, people who are not infected in your store will probably sue your ass off because you invited the virus, right? But if you take sufficient precaution, they will not be able to sue you because you did what you could do to try to not get the virus there, right? To not get your customers infected. And you inform them that this is what you're doing and whatnot else, right? So that cost, upfront cost, is sort of the prudent or wise way of running a business in a free market. Are there bad apples? Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm. Is there money involved? Can you make money off of short-term stuff? Sure. Tricking people, possibly. The problem is the reputation you'll get, right? Because the only thing you have in a perfect free market is your reputation. So if you defraud people and then move to the next town, well, they're going to wonder who you are because you don't have a reputation to begin with. So they might reach out to the people in the previous town and say, hey, who's this guy? This Per Bylund guy is offering us what seems like a really good deal. Have you heard of him before? And they're like, wow, he's a fraudster. That guy, you can't trust him, and he's just tricking everybody. And if he ever comes back to our town, we'll use tar and feathers or whatnot else, right? Well, I mean, that's basically what it would look like in a free market. So it's much easier now with communication technology, because if you have traveling snake oil salesmen today with the internet, well, good luck. You have to change your name and appearance every town you come to, right? So that's very costly. So will there be problems? Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm. The market is definitely not efficient, but it's unbeatable. So there's no better system. There's no other system that comes even close to it, but it's not perfect. And I think it's sort of a disservice to the cause, claiming that it is perfect, or the sort of libertarian answer. I mean, how do you solve this problem? The market will take care of it. I mean, it's true that the market probably will, but it's not a very good answer to the question, right? And I think the market will, and the market is more long-term than short-term. The market is not looking for getting re-elected the next election, right? And they're not looking to buy votes, but it's about serving yourself by serving others. So the incentives are in line. People might still take shortcuts, but the consumer is sovereign in the market, right? So the scope of such behavior is much, much smaller, and it probably cannot be repeated.
All right. I think that's a good answer. Peter, did you have a question?
So, sorry about that. I was muted there. I believe
Good
so. It was about the word capitalism. You've said before, I believe, that you don't like using the word capitalism because of some of its implications. Could you explain why you think free market advocates who are in favor of private property should stop using the words capitalism?
Yeah, because it confuses the hell out of people to use that word. I mean, that's probably the best short answer. I wrote a piece for the Libertarian Institute on exactly that. That is a term that it wasn't even ours to begin with, right? So it was used by people who hated that system, that capital was sort of running the show. So I mean, if you believe the world works like Piketty thinks the world works, or Karl Marx thought the world works, then capitalism, there you have the meaning of it, right? Then it was sort of adopted by classical liberals because, yeah, you can't have an advanced modern market without capital, right? But that's not quite what it was supposed to mean from the beginning. And I mean, feel free to take over words. That's perfectly fine. I mean, just like progressives stole a liberal, right? Words change their meaning, and it's always a struggle for words. But this is a word that we have tried to steal for, say, a century or so, and we have failed pretty obviously. So it doesn't make any sense to keep throwing good money after bad, in a sense, right? So we can't talk to people who do not agree with us saying that, hey, yeah, I'm for capitalism, so should you be, because they see something completely different. So the common definition of capitalism is simply, I mean, that's the fat guy with a cigar who is the industrialist, right? He owns the factory and everybody has to do whatever he says because he is the one who either hires you or not, and that's your livelihood, right? So you are completely dependent on, well, his whim, in a sense, because he has the only factory in town, right? So he has that power, and politicians are just following whatever he wants because he's hiring people and he is the creator of whatever wealth there is. And whoever believes that capitalism is that you have some people making money off of others, and you try to argue for capitalism that is exactly the reverse, basically, then why not drop the term and instead get them to adopt your ideas, right? So, I mean, I think that the term hurts us more than it benefits us. So it doesn't really matter how much in love we might be with the term, or how much sort of emotional capital we have invested in using that term. And I mean, I did too, but I realized that you can't really talk to other people who are not libertarians because they think you're an idiot. Just by using the term, they have already assumed what it is you mean. And it's not what you mean at all. So in a sense, you are, by using the term, you are choosing to fight two battles instead of one. That doesn't make any sense if you want to change the world. I mean, if you just want to waste time and effort in endless debates online, it's perfect, go for it. But if you actually want to change something, then it's not the productive way of doing it. And the term itself doesn't actually mean much, right? So it doesn't mean anything at all compared to the values. So I'm definitely in favor of using something else. And I mean, then of course the question is, what is something else? What can we use? Well, agorism would be one. The free market, I prefer myself, because it indicates not only a free market, which Republicans use, which is hilarious, but and what they mean is sort of some kind of big corporation state capitalism, right? But if you say it's a freed market, then obviously it has to be freed from something, from what? Right, so it indicates something very different than a free market, because free market seems to be anything with a corporation or anything with money involved. So no, I think it's one of those things that libertarians do that doesn't make much sense. I mean, you shouldn't shoot yourself in the foot as a strategy of moving ahead, but that's what we're doing by using and sticking to that term. And I think I realized this when I, back in, 1999, I'm dating myself here, but I started the website anarchism.net. From the beginning, it was sort of an anarcho-capitalist hub or something like that, but pretty soon it turned into an attempt to create dialogue among anarchists, because don't we all just want to get rid of the government? So why do we hate each other? So in that attempt at dialogue, I realized that by calling yourself anarcho-capitalist, all other anarchists consider that an oxymoron, because capitalism to them is necessarily based on the state. It's privileges for big corporations granted by the state. That's basically how they see it. So what does that mean, anarcho-capitalism? That's about as silly as anarcho-fascism or something like that. So you couldn't speak to them at all because they were blinded by that term, right? So instead of using a different term, it was much easier. So you could say that, oh, I'm a free market anarchist. That was totally okay because Benjamin Tucker was one, right? Lysander Spooner was one. Proudhon arguably was one. And then you don't have that first threshold, and they're not sort of in defense mode already. So they might actually listen to what you're saying. And you can have a dialogue. And then, of course, then it turns out pretty soon that they call themselves anarchists, but sure, they're not, right? Many leftist anarchists are not anarchists. They just want a different society, and they have a great plan for how to structure it in their minds, which, of course, is not very anarchistic at all.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement here, because even by Adam Smith's example, libertarians aren't necessarily like full-on capitalists in a sense, especially now with like the way capitalism has been kind of, I guess the word's been just taken over by the leftists, even though it historically was. So yeah, I'm in 100% agreement with you. Porter had a question, right?
Yeah, the last one we wanted to end on was David Friedman, in our interview with him, said something kind of controversial that I think a lot of libertarians might disagree with. And that was he was discussing Rothbard's critique of him and said that Rothbard got one thing right, that he really doesn't hate the state. That was the famous critique, was Friedman does not hate the state. And in his interview with us, he said Rothbard was right. I do not hate the state. So I wanted to get your take on that. I'm sure you disagree. Why should we, as consistent libertarians, hate the state?
Well, yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, I think part of the problem here is that Friedman was always, David Friedman, that is, not Milton, a utilitarian, right? Whereas Rothbard was a natural rights libertarian, which is different. But I think it's also different in how they define the state, because a Rothbardian would say, well, the definition of the state is basically aggression, right? It's and if as a libertarian you can't be for that, no matter what good they might do. That basis of it makes it illegitimate, right? So you have to hate it because it's a cancer on society. It destroys things all over the place. Just by its very existence, it distorts allocation of resources. It distorts prices. Everything it touches, it destroys, in a sense. Like money is a very good example. What is money when the state gets its hands on the money? Yeah, who the heck knows, right? It could be anything, and the only thing we know is that it suddenly somehow loses its purchasing power, which is very strange for something that is purchasing power. I mean, that's the fundamental function of it. So they even can screw that up. I mean, I don't know why David Friedman would say that he doesn't hate it, but of course there are plenty of things that the state does that is good stuff. but that's because they're crowding out better stuff, right? So looking at the unrealized again, wherever the state is, there could have been something voluntary to take its place. And of course, then some libertarians seem to think that public goods is a reason perhaps for the state, and such things as national defense and other such myths that people think cannot be organized in a free society. But I mean, I know that David Friedman is an anarchist, but no, I don't see how you can do anything but hate the state. On the other hand, it's sort of an abstraction too, so it doesn't make much sense to go around hating an abstraction. So I would probably say that personally, I hate most of what the state does, and definitely the implications of it, the outcome of having that type of organization. But it's really hard to put your finger on what exactly is it, right? Because it's so vast, and there's so many people involved. There's so many different interests represented. There's so many different types of things that it does. But I mean, at the core, it's coercion. War is the health of the state, and how can you not hate war? I mean, if you love people, you have to hate the state.
I think that's a great answer and something good to end on. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Insurrection Inc. It's been a great time, and hopefully we can have you back sometime maybe. And
thank you.
Before you go, is there anything you'd like to plug, like your Twitter, any recent publications?
Well, I have plenty of publications, so just look at those. I think my libertarian stuff goes back to the 90s sometime. So that there's plenty in many different places. Mises.org has a bunch of them. LouRockwell.com has a few.
Yeah,
Libertarian Institute has a bunch. Oh, yeah. But other than that, I mean, yeah, follow me on Twitter.
All right. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.